Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I got a couple of packages that we're going to be unboxing. These come from Castlemania Games. My buddy Ryan sent them to me. He's an awesome guy. I've done videos on his stuff in the past. A lot of cool stuff. Check out the website, link in the description. All sorts of cool video game stuff there if you want to get this or anything else, by all means. And thank you to Ryan again for sending this so that I could do the review. So thank you very much. So let's open this up and take a look at it. Now, there's going to be a lot to unpack to this particular video, both figuratively and literally, because we have two different packages here. But this should be pretty cool. This is gonna be pretty cool. Let me just get this first one open up here, and then there's a small one that goes with it. And first thing we have inside is some Castlemania Games stickers and a couple of packages there. And I'll toss that off to the side. And then this third little package, which I guess I'll open right now, just for the hell of it. If I can get through. It's amazing how much easier an actual box is with a box cutter, but then, you know, plastic part not as easy. Anyway, yes, so inside we have just a little adapter thing, which is going to matter in a minute. And then here we have a couple of items, some stuff there, item there, and then here we have more items. Like I said, literally and figuratively, there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, we got a bunch of cables, we got a box, we got a power supply, we got another cable, we got an adapter thing. Okay, Adam, what the hell's going on? So, the bulk of this video is about this device right here in this little package. This is called the RetroTink. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of this thing. This is not new. I mean, it's relatively new, but like it's been out there for a little bit. But unfortunately, this was the first I could really get a chance to use it and talk about it. But there it is, little device there. And this will be the focus of our video, but we'll get back to this in a minute. I also want to talk about some of this other stuff. This is just a power supply for it, and this is a little HDMI adapter for it. Actually, I don't know what this is. Let's just take a look at this. This is a different type of HDMI adapter for it. We'll go over that in a minute. And then a whole bunch of various component cables. While these items right here could be their own video, they are not going to be the focus of this video, but they are very important. What these are component cables from a company called HD Retrovision. Now, HD Retrovision, I haven't used these yet, but I've heard really good things about them. They're basically this company that's doing component cables for older game consoles that never had them, tapping into the RGB signal. So here's where we start to unpack some stuff. Let's say, for example, you're a big fan of the Super Nintendo, and you used the Super Nintendo a lot when you were a kid. Now, odds are, when you played it, you used Composite. Composite's that yellow one. Now, you used it because that's what the console came with, and it's what you connected to your TV and you played it and whatever you were a kid. And nowadays, you might even still use it because it's what it has. You just plug it in, that's the way you want to use it. But what you probably don't realize, I mean, maybe a lot of you do, because I know a lot of you are super into this stuff, but what a lot of people don't realize is that the Super Nintendo had other video output options. I guess the easiest way to describe this is the console thinks in something called RGB, but if you're using Composite, it has to degrade the image just to show you something through Composite. But why not use RGB? You know, why not use what the console is thinking to get your video quality? And so there were a lot of different options back in the day, depending on where you were in the world. You know, the Super Nintendo could support, yes, it technically supported RF, but who cares? But you would use Composite. Or if you were lucky enough, you could have S-video cables, and that would improve the image, but it's not exactly the way it was meant to be. And then if you were lucky enough to be in Europe and you had access to RGB Scart cables, you could get, you know, the full RGB signal, but that was only Europe. In North America, the best we could do was S-video until modern times, where we've had various devices that allow you to connect RGB Scart cables you import from Europe and then connect them to things like the FrameMeister, the OSSC, etc., and then use them on a modern television, so you're getting RGB signals that look really good. So that's more or less what the RetroTink is kind of trying to do. It's trying to take your older game consoles. It's a little box that takes your old game consoles, you plug them into this, plug them into a modern TV, and it looks better. That's the idea. It's a convenience device as well as trying to improve the experience. But it's limited by the fact that it only supports 3 types of input: Composite, S-video, and Component. Now, in a lot of instances, what that'll mean, we'll stick with the Super Nintendo for now, what that'll mean is that if I'm, you know, the dude who had that Super Nintendo and I always use Composite and I plug it into my modern TV, assuming I even can, because a lot of modern TVs don't even have a composite input on them. If I'm that guy and I plug it in, I'm like, oh, this looks awful. Well, this device would solve that problem for you to an extent. So you could plug your composite cables into this device, plug this into your modern TV. It'll look better, but not amazing. And the reason for that is because your modern television can't understand the low resolution that the Super Nintendo is running at, which is 240p. So what it does is it just goes, okay, that's something weird. I'm going to treat it as 480i. So it'll stretch it and then interlace it. So it looks really bad. This device is smart enough to know exactly what it's reading. It's reading a 240p Super Nintendo. So it goes, okay, I'll line double, we'll generate an artificial 480p and output that way. So it'll look better, but still not amazing. So that doesn't sound like a really reigning endorsement, does it? Well, that's because if you're using composite, that's how I would feel. But enter HD Retrovision. Like I said, one of these cables is, this one's for the, I believe, PS1 and PS2. This one is for the Super Nintendo, so we'll get back to that in a second. And this one is for the Genesis Model 2, which would therefore also support the 32X. And then there's various adapters. So this one allows, I believe, the Genesis cable to work on, I think that's a PS2 or maybe PS1. They've looked very similar. This, I believe, works on the Saturn? Yeah, I'm not, and then this is the Genesis Model 1. I think Ryan actually included 2 of these by mistake. But yeah, this would then allow it to work on like the Saturn and the Genesis Model 1. I believe PlayStation 2, or maybe this is for PS1 and then this one is specifically for PlayStation. I'll have to tinker with it, obviously. No, this is for PS2 and PS3. Sorry, it says it right on there. PS2 and PS3. So then you would use the Genesis cable and that would allow you to have access to PS1. Anyway, the point is, HD Retrovision is making component cables using the RGB signals of older game consoles that always had this beautiful video quality inside of it, but you couldn't use it. Now you can. You have their cables, you take the RetroTink, you plug it into your modern TV, you're good to go. So I'm excited about that. And like I said, these are separate products, right? And like I said, this video is mostly going to be about the RetroTink, but I just kind of wanted you guys to get a basic understanding of this. I've heard a lot of good things about these, so I'm super excited to use them. They are, but a catch to it that people need to understand, and this is why things like the RetroTink would matter. Older consoles, like I said, they support 240p. Super Nintendo's 240p, Sega Genesis, etc. They support lower resolutions, and the problem with that is if you were to plug one of these in from your Super Nintendo to your modern television, like, hey, I'm just going to plug it into a component on the back of my TV, odds are it's not going to work. And the reason it's probably not going to work is because the modern televisions do not support 240p. You might be lucky enough to have one that does, or have a computer monitor that does, but these are kind of aimed at people who want to use them on CRTs. And a lot of CRTs, of course, won't have that problem. People love CRTs, and they love the video quality of that, but they want to improve it more. So you get something like this, you run a Super Nintendo through CRT, through component, tapping into the RGB, it's going to look amazing. But if your setup is like mine, where you're using a more of a modern television, you have to have a mediator just due to that resolution issue. And this will solve that for you. So you can have component input, it knows what it's doing, does line doubling, puts it out to 480p, boom, you're good to go. Now, again, that's artificial 480p, but it's not bad. It will work. And that's important too, because most modern televisions don't even support 480i through HDMI input. A lot of information, right? A lot of babble. Guy sure talks a lot, but never gets to a point. Yes, but here's my point. If you set all this stuff up correctly, your old game consoles will look much nicer on your modern television. That's basically what it all means. And it's just kind of up to you as the user, the customer, whatever you want to think of yourself as, in this case, the person of interest to game consoles, is that you just have to define what your budget is and how much you really care. So the RetroTink, while it sounds very similar to other devices like the FrameMeister and the OSSC, is a much more affordable alternative. This is about $100 for just this device. I believe it comes just like this, and you need to provide your own power supply and your own HDMI output, which might sound like a pain, but it's not really that bad. The power supply is just mini USB. So Ryan, this is not standard is my understanding. The USB power supply I got was just Ryan doing me a solid. And it doesn't need to be like this. It can just be a USB cable you plug into any random USB device. And then with the HDMI, this is, without even using it, it to me is a flaw. So I'm just gonna be straight up honest about it. It uses mini HDMI. Mini HDMI is obviously not a standard. It's not what most things use. It was done clearly to save space on the board, and I get that completely, but it does create a bottleneck because then you either required, Ryan was cool enough to include a mini HDMI to HDMI cable, but then he also separately sent me just a mini HDMI to HDMI adapter. Now, what's the difference? Well, yes, I could just plug this into the board and then plug this in my TV and I would be good to go. However, that's the only one of those type of cables I have. And if I wanted to upgrade the cable, if I wanted to use something like the MCable or whatever with it, then I can't. But with this little adapter, I totally can. MCable separately, let's talk about that for a second. I intend to connect that to this device and just see what kind of benefits it has. The MCable is an HDMI, you might as well think of it as an HDMI cable that includes an external graphics processor in it. It has a special chip in it that redraws every pixel on the fly to basically create anti-aliasing to buff out the image of the game. In other words, magical cable that makes the games look better. Sounds like bullshit, but I swear to you is real because I've done a lot of coverage of the thing. I love that thing. It's amazing. It's an amazing piece of technology. So I always love to see how it stacks up with stuff because I always felt like it didn't do that great with retro content. Retro meaning 2D in this context, but with 3D stuff it looks pretty good. So this device, the RetroTink, is capable of housing now a whole bunch of different game consoles. It can do all the component stuff, meaning it should run GameCube, it should run PlayStation 2, obviously we got the special cables for that. Original Xbox I'm a little concerned about because original Xbox could output higher resolutions, and I've only heard this thing outputs 480p, so I'm gonna have to tinker with that. It should support the Wii, of course, and then that's all through component. Then, of course, anything HD Retrovision made, that's great. You might also be wondering why did HD Retrovision make a PS2/PS3 component cable when even Sony did that? My understanding is theirs is much better, so I'm very, very looking forward to checking that out. But this thing also supports S-Video. S-Video to me, in most instances, is not going to be needed. It's nice that it's on there. It's kind of surprising that it is. But I think it was there because a lot of consoles, again, say the Super Nintendo. Say you're that guy with the Super Nintendo. If you're in North America, you really wouldn't have any way to get to RGB unless you bought these proprietary RGB basic component cables for your Super Nintendo. But S-Video cables for the Super Nintendo exist everywhere. Are they as good as these? No, but they're going to be a massive improvement over composite. So that's why that's there. Although in my particular case, the only reason I would ever use the S-Video is for consoles where that was their maximum. One such example would be the 3DO. The 3DO outputs, I believe it's RF, who cares, composite and S-Video. It doesn't support any sort of RGB out. So if you want to use the 3DO, pop it in here through S-Video, you're good to go. And in my case, again, composite, I'm almost never going to use. I can only think of a handful of consoles, mostly from the mid-'80s, like the Atari 7800. Actually, no, that doesn't even have composite out. I'm thinking of like the NES. The NES, perfect example, it has composite out and RF out. RF's useless, so you're going to connect composite to this. Now, personally, I don't even use the original NES. If I did, I have an RGB modded one. I also have the AVS, so I don't need it. But I don't, of course, my needs don't apply to everybody else's. So it's entirely up to you. Now, this is, you're probably like, dude, that's a lot. What the hell are you talking about? This is a lot going on. So let me try and simplify this. If you use an old game console that has either composite, S-Video, or component, you can use it with this device. And then it's up to you entirely how much you care about improving that individual game console. Sadly, there is no universal answer for this because every console has some sort of rule or exception. So like Super Nintendo, I keep going back to that one, but the Super Nintendo, you could just plug in composite. And you could just use this that way. And it would look better than plugging it in directly, but that doesn't mean that's what you should do. What you should do in that case is get the HD Retrovision component cables and do it that way. Or you could do S-Video as mentioned before. Then there's other ones that should work, but they can't because they don't exist, like the Atari Jaguar. The Atari Jaguar supports RGB on board, just like the Super Nintendo does. But HD Retrovision hasn't exactly sat down and made component cables for the Atari Jaguar, and realistically never will, because it's such a niche thing. Now, personally, I have RGB Scart cables for it, but there's no way to use them on the RetroTink. So what you would have to do is either have third-party S-Video cables for the Atari Jaguar, or most likely, you're just going to use composite cables with the Jaguar. So in that regard, the RetroTink has, it gives you options and it gives certain advantages, but at the same time, it's a little dependent on HD Retrovision and their cables in order to get the best out of your older stuff. But the point is, it's there. And I can't blame them for not wanting to put an RGB Scart port on here, especially if this thing is designed to cater to North America and you want to keep costs down, because any sort of changes like that are going to be expensive. So let's take a look at the device itself. Hopefully everybody's kind of on board at this point where we are. There's not much to this. It's got 2 buttons on it. The top button is for smoothing on and off. Now, this is a bonus feature of the RetroTink. Now, the RetroTink can basically, if you have this mode off, then it's just going to give you a direct pass-through of your video signal. So it's going to look like it's supposed to look originally, but with minor improvements just because it's doing line doubling. However, with the smoothing mode on, that can theoretically, very similar to the MCable in that regard, can buff out the image a bit and make things look a little nicer. Now, I haven't used it personally, but from what I've seen, basically the opinion on that is mixed. It looks better with 3D content, but with 2D content, it's not as much, and that's largely because it buffs out the pixelization, and the pixelization in a lot of cases is what people like for nostalgic reasons. So that's entirely up to you. Either way, the button's there for your choice. The other button, the lower one, is a manual switch to go between component input, S-video input, or composite input. And then there's the other 2 ports over here, of course, are sound. Now, you'll basically always keep your sound cables connected and just be switching between these devices. The other thing is it only supports 1 device at a time, so it's not wise to keep multiple different things plugged in because there's no point. And on the back, it has a couple of different ports. Like I said, that's a USB port for power, and the other one is micro or mini HDMI for video output. Beyond that, not much to say without using it, so hopefully we're all on board here. We all get where we're going, and I'm gonna go ahead and try it out and see what I think. Okay, so I've been using this stuff for a while, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, I know that I said this video was really more about the RetroTink than it is about the HD Retrovision cables, and that's true. I gotta admit, the HD Retrovision cables really stole the show. Like, these things are really great. And those guys over there, they did a fantastic job making these things. They're really quite solid. And that says a lot because I really don't like Component in general, but these things offer a solid picture, and I really recommend them for anybody who's interested in having component output for various retro consoles, which we'll talk more about those in a bit. But the RetroTink itself, I don't dislike it. I don't want to give that impression, but it does leave something to be desired. It is what it is. It's a budget device that's aimed to be the equivalency of the FrameMeister or anything like that. And means that's a hard thing to compare to, but okay, let me just give some examples. While its big advantage is that it's much cheaper than those things, that cost reduction comes with some flaws. So the first thing up is the production of it. It feels a little cheap. And that's because of this, I guess, plexiglass design. Now, people who have watched my videos for years know I'm not opposed to such designs. In fact, I've highly recommended things by the Bahar Bros, who use the same basic plexiglass design, where you have a board in between these things and it's just kind of held together with a couple bits of plastic. That's totally true. But it's not that aspect of it that bothers me. It's the Bahar Bros devices don't require you to constantly touch the board. They don't require you to connect and disconnect stuff. I mean, they have an option there, but it's very rarely used. This is not the same. The RetroTink does require you to constantly interact with it, which is problematic. It gets a little hot, which is a little concerning, but then it's not like it hurts to touch it or anything. It's concerning how warm it gets so quickly. Interacting with the buttons can be a little bit annoying, but that's small potatoes. What bothers me is the frequency at which I have to connect and disconnect these to the ports, because the ports are not really locked in any way other than the soldering that's kind of holding them together. So I would notice as I would connect or disconnect cables sometimes that the things would start to crack and make noise, and it felt like it was gonna break. Now, it never actually did, of course. It's still here, it still works. But the closest that ever came was I connected a set of S-video cables by Monster. You know, those ones that have like those death claw grips on them? And I tried connecting it. I really couldn't. I almost got one into the white audio port, and it was bending, and it felt like it was gonna come off. And even now, when I connect stuff to it, they just kind of, you know, jostle a little bit. They don't really stay in place. So that feels bad. And that wouldn't be that big of a deal if it was something you were just keeping in there permanently. But the whole point of this device is the ability to connect multiple things, which means you have to disconnect stuff and connect stuff all the time. Unless you have some sort of high-end switch box, which for Component, there aren't really any good high-end switch boxes, at least that I know of. So you will be disconnecting and reconnecting a lot. And that feels like a flaw. That feels like something that's gonna break over time. But that said, while it operates, there's only a couple other things I really want to note. I was wrong about something earlier. I said that it only had an on and off mode regarding the smoothing, because that's what I was led to believe, but it turns out there's actually a third mode. The third mode is actually just disabling the upscaling entirely. So like I said before, the thing takes your signal and doubles the resolution so it works on a modern TV, because modern TVs do not understand 240p generally, especially through an HDMI input. But this device actually does have the option to turn it off so that it does attempt to pass through a 240p image through HDMI. And it's funny, my 4K LG TV somehow supports 240p through HDMI. I don't know. I had no idea that was a feature. So that's awesome. Thank you to the RetroTink for teaching me that. Not particularly useful information, but just cool, just to know that I can test that from now on if I ever really need to. So yeah, technically it has a third option there where you can turn it off, though in most instances you probably won't need that. But it's there, and I appreciate that. But the last thing that I have is any sort of criticism of this thing before we go into the positive type of stuff is this thing has one really serious Achilles heel that I'm still baffled by. It does not support progressive scan inputs. And so what does that mean? If you take the GameCube, for example, it has component cables that exist for it. It has games that support the high resolution modes, 480p modes. If you connect the GameCube to this device through the component inputs and you set a game to progressive scan or high resolution modes, you would think this device would just pass it through. It does not. In fact, it just displays this really weird, funky error. I was unable to capture it with hardware, but here's some footage of it off of my television with my camera. It basically splits the image in two and just looks really distorted. At first I thought maybe this was just the GameCube, and if you remember in the earlier part of the video I made mention of the fact I was curious how it would handle something like the original Xbox, where it could output higher resolutions like 720p. When this thing only outputs 480p, how's that going to work? The answer is it doesn't. It just has an error. And then I tried it with the PlayStation 2 in one of those rare instances where you have a progressive scan compatible game. Same problem. I didn't test it with the Wii, but I know it would be the same result. Anything that's progressive scan is simply not going to work. So that really got me like puzzled. Because when I look at this thing, maybe this is my own assumption, when I look at it, I think of it as, okay, cool, it supports composite, it supports S-video, and supports component. And there are various consoles that max out at those various formats. But when it comes to component, the number is comically limited. It's the Wii, it's the GameCube, it's the Xbox, it's the PS2. That's it. Everything else either didn't quite make it to component, or it went on to use HDMI. So it's a very small pool of consoles. And in all four of those instances, they support higher resolution modes. But this device doesn't. So you got to wonder what it's aiming at. And then I thought about it some more and I thought, they're not trying to use component as we typically think of it, I guess, where they're trying to use component as an RGB equivalency, which is misleading. And I don't think there was any deviant attempt there. I don't want to get that impression. I think really what this thing is supposed to you're supposed to look at it and go, oh, that supports component, when really it's not supporting component, it supports RGB. Almost think of these cables or these inputs as a SCART port. Don't think of them as component ports. Because really that's what they're trying to tap into, is to get RGB out of older consoles. But it doesn't really stress that in its, I'm not going to say it's marketing necessarily, but it doesn't really give off that impression, which is unfortunate because obviously the device outputs 480p, so it's a little sad that it can't understand input of 480p and then just put that back out, because then at least the GameCube and the Wii would have no problems. Xbox and PS2 might still have some, but at least you'd two more consoles just unlocked. So that's unfortunate, and I think that's eventually going to apply to the Dreamcast as well, because I know HD Retrovision is making Dreamcast component cables, and VGA games are essentially progressive scan 480p games, so my guess is they won't work. I don't know, I don't have them, but that would be my guess. So that's a little unfortunate. So once you understand that this device is not meant as the component to HDMI, I guess, converter that I kind of believed it would be, because I've always said that that was one of the FrameMeister's biggest Achilles heels, was that the FrameMeister can do that, it just sucks at it. So if this device did it better, then great, I have this awesome reason to use this thing all the time. But unfortunately, that reason doesn't exist. Now that said, that makes sound like some negative, like I'm raining all over it. That's not the case, because I guess that's not what this thing is supposed to do. So what is it supposed to do, and does it do it well? And the answer is actually yes. It does take those other inputs. It takes composite, it takes S-video, and takes, I guess, technically more RGB. and it actually makes them work quite solid. So enough talking, let me show you some footage. So the first thing I did was I decided, we were talking about the Super Nintendo, right? That's what we were talking about at the beginning of the video. So I decided to connect the Super Nintendo to this thing. This is a direct connection of Super Nintendo with composite with no smoothing. This is, if you were just to buy this box and use your original Super Nintendo composite cables and do nothing, this is the result. Now, yes, technically it works. You can see an image, you can play the game, and maybe that's good enough for you. Wouldn't be good enough for me, but it's there. And you can also see it here compared to, you know, you press on the smoothing button, you'll see it kind of buffs out the image a bit. Now, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this whole concept because the buffering thing, some people like that and some people don't. That really boils down to personal opinion, and I'll talk more about that later. But yeah, so there you get a very basic sense of what you can do with the cheapest route, which is composite and this device. But that's not the way I recommend it. So next up, you got here, we have S-Video. Now, I should have mentioned, obviously, we're using Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Tournament Fighters, or whatever else it's called. This game's actually really fun. But yeah, this game's also very colorful and stuff, uses some good models. I thought this would be a good example. But yeah, so this is running with S-Video without the smoothing again. So as you can see, big upgrade over composite. And yeah, it looks solid, I think. But you can add the smoothing in as well, and this is your same basic result that you're gonna get out of that. Not bad, not at all, you know, but again, the smoothing thing ends up being personal preference, and it can eventually be overkill, as we'll talk about. But moving on, we now have it the way I think it was intended to use. This is with the HD Retrovision RGB component cables. Now these are pretty cool. I think this looks pretty solid, and this is kind of what I would expect it to look like. And I also feel like this, without the smoothing on, with the RGB component cables, this is how I feel most people would ideally want to use, say, the Super Nintendo in the context of the RetroTink, is this particular setting. That's my guess, but just again, just for comparison's sake, we have it now running with smoothing on. And with smoothing on, again, it buffs out. Now, this is kind of my opinion on the whole smoothing thing. I'm not here to tell you like which one is objectively better, because that's not a thing. It's an opinion. It's like scan lines. Everybody's got their own 2 cents on the matter. I personally feel that the buffering looks a lot better on 3D-based content than it does on 2D-based content. But there's a very logical argument to make that the 2D-based content stuff, it's more nostalgia that's pulling you in that direction as opposed to maybe more of an objective standpoint. You'd have to probably ask someone who has no nostalgic vibe for anything, just a kid maybe, and ask them which looks better. Maybe they can give you a more solid result that's not hindered with some sort of bias, but there you go. But anyway, so yes, RGB with smoothing, and then I decided to just really kind of go extreme with it. So I decided to attach the M cable. As mentioned before, M cable will do a lot of buffering and stuff on its own. So I decided to connect the M cable to the RetroTink and turn off the native smoothing of the RetroTink and just see what it does. And this is the result. And yeah, the M cable, it does the same basic thing in that regard. It buffs it out. Again, that's up to you if you like it or not. Then just for the shits and giggles, I decided to really just amp it up. So I turned on the smoothing of the RetroTink and as well as the M cable, so you have this thing going full out. Maybe you feel like that's vomitous. I don't know. That wasn't the point. I'm not trying to make the point that this is best. I'm trying to make the point that this is what it looks like when you do all that stuff. Now, again, I want to stress the buffering thing, in my opinion, really shines when it comes to 3D content, and we're going to get back to that, particularly with the PlayStation 2. But now you have kind of a general sense of the increase in video quality and changes you can have based on the cable, and kind of the market it's aimed at, because it really is kind of aimed at that era, you know, the mid-90s type of technology era, console era. But I also decided to compare it to the thing I think that most people would use alternatively. This is the FrameMeister running through RGB Scart. There's no buffering of any kind on this. This is how traditionally I use my Super Nintendo, and it looks like this. So if I compare it to the setting I feel that most people would use the RetroTink with, this is again the component RGB, no smoothing of any kind. You know, you get kind of a side-by-side here, and it's pretty solid, and I think that's how most people would prefer to play the Super Nintendo. That's just kind of my guess. But yeah, that's a general sense of how the whole thing works. Now I'm going to give you some more examples of other consoles that were connected to it, although I'm not going to do the whole, you know, running the gambit there and just show you every single thing, just kind of a general thing. So when it comes to these cables, like I said, we got the Super Nintendo ones, which are cool because they're actually, it turns out they're compatible with an RGB modded N64. So here's some footage of that. This is a 64DD like OS just running. I have this running extreme. I have it running with the component cables through the RetroTink smoothing on, M cable on, this is the result. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've never seen the N64 look better. I think that looks really nice because it's more 3D content, and the buffering I think really helps with that. Some people might not agree, but that's how I feel about it. So I liked that. I thought that was really good. The whites are really solid. It just seems like a good image. But keep in mind, that's not how your N64 is going to look. That requires a lot. That requires an RGB modded N64. That requires these RGB component cables by HD Retrovision. It requires a RetroTink. It requires an MCable. It requires a lot of stuff to get that type of image. Point is, it's possible if you want to, it's there. And just for those who are curious what it would look like with the RetroTink, there you go. I decided to connect it with a few others. We'll talk more about the PlayStation 2 again in a bit, because that is a nice sweet spot. But they also included Sega Genesis cables. Thank you, Castlemania Games. The Sega Genesis cables are amusing because I think this must have been done in a joke over at HD Retrovision. I appreciate that. If this was intentional, it's a great sense of humor. The HD Retrovision Genesis cable supports add-ons, as I mentioned before, because I mean, what other console would make the most sense to have add-ons? Like these 4 that I showed earlier, although I didn't go over them well enough. What we have here is a PlayStation 1 cable. We have a Genesis Model 1 cable, a Neo Geo model, both for CD and AES, as well as a Sega Saturn cable. So you basically just attach these to the Genesis cable and you can see the results. So let's take a look at some of those. First up, we were talking about the Genesis. So this is the Sega Genesis running with, again, with these cables, with the smoothing on and with the MCable. Am I saying this is the way you should set it up? No. That's a matter of opinion. I actually kind of feel it's a little too buffed out, so I would have to tinker, RetroTink, more with it later if I really wanted to. But that's just kind of what it looks like. Now, oddly, I then connected it to the Sega CD and I ran Batman Returns, and I felt this actually looked a lot better. Now, it might be because Batman Returns is a Sega CD game that used a lot of rotating and scaling features of the Sega CD, so it has this almost like artificial 3D look to it, which I felt kind of made it look better. That's obviously a matter of opinion, but I liked the way this looked. And then I also decided to throw in the most 3D oriented content I could for that platform, which would be the 32X, and I specifically picked a game called Darkside. Darkside was a PAL exclusive. We never got it over here. I have a repro of it designed for North American consoles, and it runs. It's very 3D oriented. It's not a particularly good game or anything, but you can kind of get a sense of how buffed out something can really look on the 32X using this whole setup. And I think it looks solid, but it might also just be too much. Again, that's a matter of opinion. That's what it's always going to be, is a matter of opinion. But I personally liked the result of it. Then I decided to get a little weird with it. So this is kind of obscure, but there were 6 games released for the Sega Genesis, Sega CD 32X combo. That is 6 games that actually needed all 3 devices in order to run. 5 of them were released in North America. 1 was only released in Brazil. It's a game called Surgical Strike, and it's what you're currently looking at. So this game did actually come out on multiple platforms in North America. It even got a normal North American Sega CD release. But this version only came out in Brazil, and what it is the Sega CD game, but uses the additional benefits of the 32X for a greater color palette. So I decided to run this obscure particular title with this setup just to see the results. And as you can see, I mean, it's just FMV footage, but it's just kind of interesting to see that. So then I decided to connect it to a few other things. I connected it to the Sega Saturn, which you can see here I have running Burning Rangers. Now, Burning Rangers is a really cool Sega Saturn exclusive and a very chunky one. This really helped with that. It really buffed out a lot of that stuff. And again, it's the 3D stuff I feel that really benefits more from all the type of smoothing and all that stuff. But this is the result. Now, I did notice that for some reason the footage was a little dark. It didn't really appear that way on my television, so I don't know if this was a recording issue or what this was, but the footage is darker than it actually appears on screen. But that said, it still looked, I thought, pretty nice. But again, some might argue too buffed. But then again, is that just because of nostalgia, or is that actually right? Hard to say, because we're literally retro-tinking with the past. But then I also decided to connect it to the PlayStation 1 for the same basic test, using Twisted Metal 2, which is a game I'm sure a vast majority of you would know over Burning Rangers, and just to kind of see what that looks like. And again, pretty solid, buffed out, looks good. Same problem though, it seemed a little dark, and I still don't know if to attribute that to the recording process or what, but that said, it looks good. Keep in mind, as I keep saying, the settings for all of these is RetroTink is on, it's smoothing, using the component cables for by HD Retrovision, and using MCable. I can't stress that enough. This is all the pieces required for this particular image. I did not actually run it with the Neo Geo stuff, but I'm sure it would be very solid. And then I didn't have a reason to run it with Genesis Model 1 either, because it's still the Genesis. So The last thing I want to focus on here is a nice bright spot to this whole thing, which is the PlayStation 2. So the PlayStation 2 infamously has very poor video quality. I've done videos on it in the past, and it's really unfortunate because it's a good game console, and it's really sad that it just really doesn't clean up well compared to its contemporary rivals that all do. And third-party companies haven't really had any great success with fixing that, largely because it's just a limitation of the hardware that Sony put in there, and it's a limitation of the software in that Sony didn't really push progressive scan on too many of their games. What I mean by that is there's about 5,000 PS2 games worldwide. Only about 190 of them support high-resolution modes. That's comically low. When the Dreamcast, like 90-95% of its games do. The original Xbox is like 90-95% of its games do. GameCube, about 50%. Wii, about almost 100%. PS2, it's a drop in the bucket. It's like nothing, which is really sad, but this is, in a way, why it kind of works well with this. Because it only supports, for the most part, 480i, if you take the HD Retrovision cables, which full props to them, those are the best component PS2 cables I've ever seen, ever. Much better than the official Sony brand ones. You connect that to the RetroTink, and you run the RetroTink with smoothing, and then you connect an M cable. I've never seen the PS2 look better off of actual PS2 hardware. I mean, yes, it's looked better off of like the PlayStation 3, and it's looked better, especially off PlayStation 3 when it's a game that supports progressive scan, but like I said, most don't. So I want to show you some examples. This is Twisted Metal Head-On, which was a PSP game originally, later released on the PlayStation 2 with some lost Twisted Metal Black content, including this mode where you like run around as Sweet Tooth. So this is that, but played in just standard vanilla footage. Like this is the HD Retrovision cables just being recorded straight, and that's the result. Then I decided, okay, now let's take that and compare it to the RetroTink using smoothing and using the M cable. And it really helps. Like it's not, we're not talking like next generation content here because you're never going to get that. But at the same time, because it's 3D content, it's more modern 3D content that really was kind of, had a lot of jaggies in it. You really can kind of see it improve a lot. So again, I know it's quick clips here, but it's just kind of a nice way to compare the two, I think. And so what I guess I would say is, in my opinion, that's the best feature of the RetroTink, is the ability to clean up the PlayStation 2 via component, but you also need extra pieces. But that's me personally. Obviously, I don't represent everybody on the market who's going to want this. A lot of people are just going to want it just to connect their NES to the, just to connect to the TV, and you can do that. There's no reason you can't. But to really get the most out of the RetroTink, you are going to have to invest in a whole series of these component cables by HD Retrovision. It's kind of like necessary because, like I said, the actual native component consoles that exist won't work with it. So you're going to have to find this, or maybe RGB to component adapters if there are anything like that, but that seems like a whole different mess of problems when you could just go direct like this. So keep that in mind. Another feature of the RetroTink is its ability to handle PAL content. So what it'll do is, much like the North American stuff where it takes 480i, doubles it, this will take 576i, which is the PAL, the more traditional PAL resolution, and it'll line double it to 576p. So what does that mean? If you have a TV or monitor that supports 576p, then you'll be able to play PAL content with this. But if you don't, then you'll need an extra step. So in the footage you're looking at, I also attached an M cable, and the M cable will then adjust the resolution to 1080p. So at the very least, you'll be able to play the game and display it. So it's kind of an extra bonus feature of the RetroTink, but it's only like half there. The line doubling of PAL content is really more for actual PAL users, but I kind of wanted to show it to you guys in action. So you'll notice a couple of things. First is that at the top of the screen, you'll see that it's kind of jittering a little bit. It does that as a result of the smoothing on the RetroTink as well as the smoothing on the M cable. It's not nearly as bad when you look at it on a television. In the footage, it's a lot jumpier, and I think that has something to do with my capturing device. So I would kind of ignore that, but it is technically there. And the other thing to note is that what you're looking at is a game called Kokoto Platform Jumper for the GameCube. This is a PAL exclusive GameCube. However, it's also being run in RGB mode because, again, the PAL stuff, they don't really deal with component, and the RetroTink, it doesn't understand GameCube high definition component. So what you're looking at is RGB mode, which is annoying because only PAL GameCubes have RGB mode. So you have a PAL GameCube running a PAL exclusive game into the RetroTink, which is line doubling it from 576i to 576p, connected to the M cables, connected to the device so it can capture. What does that mean? It means you can technically play PAL stuff, but there's extra steps. but the option is technically there. But again, if you're that guy who's just like, man, I just want to hook up my Super Nintendo, I just want to play it, you can do that. But the RetroTink allows you to upgrade and do it better. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to Castlemania Games for hooking me up with this. And I will see you all later.